August 16th, 1945. On Uliuli Gulch, Oahu, the air hung thick, a wet blanket tasting of red dirt and sugarcane. It was different from the air on Saipan. That air had tasted of salt, cordite, and fear. Here, the air was just heavy, indifferent. Fumiko watched a line of ants march across the wooden floor of the barracks, their path ruthlessly straight. She had been tracking their progress for 3 days. It was a way to measure time when the sun and the meal bells were the only other clocks. A man in a khaki uniform stood in the doorway. His shadow fell long and cool across the floor, momentarily eclipsing the ants. He said nothing. He carried a metal tray. On the tray were small tin cups. He moved down the line of women, his boots scuffing quietly on the planks. He handed a cup to each. Fumiko took hers. The metal was cold, colder than anything she had touched in years. It stung her fingertips. She looked inside. A smooth white mound. It wasn't rice. It wasn't fish. A small wooden spoon, flat like a tiny paddle, was stuck in it. She looked at the other women. At Hannah, the nurse, who held the cup up to her nose, sniffing cautiously. At Chio, the teacher, who was watching the guard's face, trying to read an intention that wasn't there. His expression was flat, bored. Just a boy doing a job. He finished his task and left, the screen door slapping shut behind him. The silence returned, punctuated by the buzz of a fly near the rafters. Fumiko nudged the white mound with the spoon. It yielded softly. She scooped a tiny amount and brought it to her lips. The cold was a shock, a sharp, clean pain on her tongue. Then, an impossible wave of sweetness. Rich, creamy. It coated her mouth, melting into a flavor she had no name for. It was not the thin, desperate sweetness of a stolen piece of sugar cane chewed until her jaw ached. This was different. This was absolute. It was a sweetness without consequence, without cost. Her mind went blank. For a moment, there was no camp, no war, no memory. There was only this sensation. Then the memories returned, not as thoughts, but as a physical recoil. Her brother, his face hollowed by hunger. The single, shared potato, boiled in seawater. The taste of dirt. A hot, sharp pressure built behind her eyes. A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It dripped from her chin, a tiny, salty offering onto the red dirt floor. She looked up. Across the room, Hannah was also crying. Silently. The spoon trembled in her hand. Chio stared into her cup, her shoulders shaking. They were not wailing. They were not sobbing. It was a quiet, bewildered grief. A weeping induced not by pain or loss, but by a small cup of frozen cream. The ants continued their march, oblivious. The sweetness in Fumiko's mouth was an accusation. It was an obituary for a world of suffering that, until this moment, she had believed was the only one that existed. The cold cup grew slick with condensation in her trembling hand. What was this weapon? This gentle, white, devastating thing. This was not a prison as they had understood it. It was a paradox delivered on a tray. They were the Okinawan and Japanese civilians, mostly women and children, swept up after the Battle of Saipan. Just weeks before, they were cowering in caves, their world reduced to the shriek of artillery and the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. The propaganda had been clear, a litany drilled into them by the Imperial Army. Americans were kichiku, brute beasts. They would rape the women, kill the men, and dash the babies against the rocks. Surrender was not an option. It was a defilement worse than death. The cliffs of Saipan were littered with the bodies of those who had believed it, entire families leaping into the sea in a final, desperate act of purity. The women in this barracks were the ones who had hesitated, the ones who had been too weak, too scared, or too stubborn to die. They had been herded onto ships, a dazed and skeletal cargo, their minds still braced for the promised atrocities. Instead, they arrived here, to a valley on an island they didn't know, ringed by barbed wire. But inside the wire, the logic of their world inverted. The first shock was the water. A spigot in the open that produced clean water on demand. A woman could turn a handle, and water would simply appear, as much as she wanted. On Saipan, a cup of brackish rainwater was a treasure, hoarded and protected. Here, girls barely old enough to walk were splashing in it, laughing. The second shock was the food. 3 times a day, a bell would ring and they would be led to a mess hall. There, they were given trays. Trays with heaps of rice, stew with actual meat, bread, sometimes even fruit. An apple, a whole, perfect apple, given to a single person. The women would stare at it, turning it over and over in their hands, before breaking it into tiny pieces to share. They could not comprehend the casual surplus. The risk they had known was immediate, physical, and total. A bomb, a bayonet, starvation. The new risk was abstract, insidious. It was the risk of losing their bearings, of having their entire moral compass shattered by inexplicable abundance. Their previous constraints were the laws of physics and warfare, a finite supply of food, the trajectory of a shell. Their new constraints were administrative. A roll call at dawn, a curfew at dusk, a list of rules posted in clumsy Japanese on a bulletin board. The fences kept them in, but the routine was what truly contained them. It was a system, and they were inside it, their lives suddenly governed by a logic they could not decipher. Their captors were not the monsters they had been promised. They were simply personnel. They were clerks, cooks, guards. Men who performed their duties with a baffling, almost boring consistency. This predictability was more unsettling than random cruelty would have been. It implied an order, a set of rules they were not privy to, from a world they could not imagine. The camp wasn't just a place of confinement. It was a classroom in a new and terrifying reality. The contrast was a daily assault on their senses and their memory. It was staged in the most mundane, repeatable details of their lives. Back on Saipan, a meal was a moment of animalistic urgency. A woman might have a single rice ball for the day, its center dotted with a sour, pickled plum, the yomebashi. She would eat it slowly, making it last, her body coiled with the constant, low-grade pain of hunger. Here, in the mess hall, she was handed a tray. The tray was heavy. It held a mound of white rice, a ladle of beef and vegetable stew, 2 slices of soft white bread, and a piece of fruit. The sheer caloric density was a physical shock. Her shrunken stomach would cramp, rejecting the richness. But the next day, the tray would appear again. The same impossible weight. The same casual plenty. Water was the second rung on the ladder of contrast. In the caves, it was the currency of life. A small tin collected rainwater, each drop precious. It was often murky, tasting of rust and earth. A mother would give her share to her child, her own lips cracking from thirst. She knew the precise calculus of dehydration. Here, rows of spigots jutted from a long pipe over a concrete basin. The water was clear and cold. There was no limit. Children played with it. Women washed their hair, a luxury forgotten for months, the soap provided in thick, unscented bars. They would let the water run over their hands, mesmerized by its thoughtless, endless flow. One older woman, Sada, was seen simply standing at the basin for half an hour, opening and closing the tap, as if testing a law of nature she could not bring herself to believe. She had lost 2 grandchildren to dysentery from contaminated water. This profligate stream felt like a personal insult to their memory. Then there was the matter of hygiene and medicine. Sickness in the caves was a death sentence. A small cut would fester in the damp tropical heat. There were no antiseptics, no clean bandages. A nurse like Hannah had been forced to use rags torn from clothing, boiled in seawater to pack wounds. Here, there was an infirmary, a clean, quiet building that smelled of disinfectant. It was staffed by American medics and nurses who moved with an unhurried, almost clinical detachment. They had sulfa powder for infections. They had aspirin for fevers. They had neat rolls of sterile gauze. When a child developed a deep, rattling cough, he was not left to fate. He was taken to the infirmary, examined, and given medicine. The women watched this with a mixture of relief and profound suspicion. This careful preservation of life felt unnatural. They had been steeped in a culture of heroic death. The meticulous bureaucratic preservation of civilian captives was an idea so foreign it felt like a trap. The contrast was not just between scarcity and abundance. It was between a world where life was cheap and expendable and a world where it was, for some reason, being managed. The women processed these contrasts through the lenses of their past roles. Their observations were not abstract. They were specific, quantifiable, and rooted in their lived expertise. Hannah, the nurse, became the group's unofficial physician and chronicler of bodies. In the first weeks, her mind was a running tally of symptoms. The dull hair, the sores that wouldn't heal, the skeletal thinness of the children. Now, she cataloged the signs of recovery. She noticed the slight rounding of a girl's cheek, the return of color to an old woman's lips. She saw the children's laughter turn from a reedy, weak sound into something robust and full. Most privately, she noted the return of menstruation among the younger women. It was a secret, a shared, unspoken signal that their bodies were beginning to trust this new reality, even if their minds did not. It was a biological fact that defied their ideological training. Bodies, Hannah knew, did not lie. They did not care about honor or shame. They cared about calories and iron. When she looked at the American medics, she saw not saviors or demons, but colleagues of a sort. She analyzed their techniques, the way they held a syringe, the sterile field they prepared for even minor procedures. Their competence was impersonal, and that, to her, was the most significant clue. This was not charity. It was protocol. Chio, the teacher, focused on the social and psychological landscape. She watched the children with a professional eye. They were the first to adapt. They learned a few words of English from the guards. Hello, okay, chocolate. They invented games that incorporated the routines of the camp. They had forgotten the sound of artillery faster than the adults. Chio worried about this. She saw their cultural memory being overwritten by this new, strange grammar of life. She began to hold informal classes, gathering the children to retell traditional stories, to practice writing characters in the dirt with a stick. It was an act of quiet resistance. She also studied the guards. She learned to tell them apart not by their faces, which seemed impossibly similar, but by their gaits, the way they held their rifles. She noted that they, too, seemed bored, trapped in the same routine as the prisoners. One young guard had a habit of whistling the same tune every afternoon. It was a simple, melancholy melody. Chio found herself listening for it. The tune was a small, human crack in the monolithic facade of the enemy. It suggested a world of feeling and memory inside him, a world she was barred from, but whose existence she could now confirm. Sada, an elder who had been a community leader, embodied the deep-seated skepticism. She saw the abundance as a trick. They are fattening us like pigs for the slaughter, she would whisper at night in the barracks. The others would fall silent, the fear rekindling. Sada's worldview was built on an unshakable belief in the Japanese spirit, the Yamato Damashii, which thrived on hardship and sacrifice. This comfort, this ease, was a spiritual poison. She continued to hoard food, hiding crusts of bread or pieces of fruit in her bedding, unable to break the habit of a lifetime of scarcity and a few months of active starvation. Her behavior was a constant, tangible reminder of the world they had left, a counter-narrative to the evidence of their own senses. Her refusal to accept the new reality was a source of friction, but also a strange comfort. As long as Sada distrusted the Americans, a part of their old world, their identity, remained intact. Her suspicion was an anchor, keeping them from drifting too far, too fast, into this bewildering new sea. The logic underpinning this strange new world was not kindness, but vast, invisible architecture of rules and logistics. This system had a name, though the women would never hear it spoken: the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. This international treaty, which the United States had ratified but Japan had not, dictated the minimum standards for humane treatment. It was not a document about compassion. It was a document about reciprocity and the orderly management of war's human debris. It stipulated that prisoners must be provided with food, shelter, and medical care equivalent to that of the detaining power's own depot troops. It was a rule book, and the American military, a culture built on standardization and procedure, was following it. The chain of causality that delivered a scoop of ice cream to Fumiko's tin cup began thousands of miles away in offices in Washington, D.C. A line in the Geneva Convention was translated into a U.S. Army regulation. That regulation was then converted into a series of procurement orders and shipping manifests by the Quartermaster Corps. This logistical behemoth, the largest and most complex organization of its kind in human history, was tasked with supplying everything from bullets to butter for millions of soldiers, and now hundreds of thousands of prisoners across the globe. A quartermaster in California, consulting a dietary chart, ordered a certain tonnage of dairy products. That order was filled by a factory. The product was loaded onto a ship. The ship sailed to Hawaii. The crates were unloaded onto a truck, and the truck drove to Onilialai Gulch. The guard who handed Fumiko the cup was the final, human endpoint of a colossal, non-human process. He was not giving her a gift. He was distributing material according to a schedule. The women, of course, saw none of this. They could only observe the effects and try to reverse engineer the cause. They interpreted the system through the metaphor of a great, unthinking machine. A machine that dispensed food at regular intervals. A machine that provided medical care to keep its components, the prisoners, in functional order. A machine that was powerful and predictable, but utterly without malice or affection. This realization, dawning slowly, was both terrifying and liberating. It was terrifying because it confirmed their own insignificance. They were not individuals to their captors. They were units to be processed. But it was liberating because it began to absolve them of the shame of being captured. One could not be shamed by a machine. A machine had no honor to satisfy. Chio, watching the supply trucks rumble past the fence each morning, saw it most clearly. She saw the identical crates, the stenciled numbers, the unvarying routine. This wasn't a relationship between conqueror and conquered. It was a relationship between manager and inventory. Understanding this did not make them free, but it changed the nature of their cage. The camp's administrative machinery processed not just their bodies, but their identities. This created a new, secondary contrast. The experience of being systematically dehumanized by wartime propaganda versus the experience of being systematically bureaucratized by their captors. On Saipan, they were faceless threats, part of a fanatical horde to be eliminated. The pamphlets dropped from American planes depicted Japanese soldiers as apes or demons. The women and children were, at best, collateral damage, at worst, part of the threat themselves. They had internalized this, feeling their own humanity shrink under the weight of the bombs and the ideology of self-destruction. In the camp, this changed. The process began upon arrival. They were lined up and registered. Each woman was made to state her name, her age, her place of origin. A translator, usually a Nisei, a second-generation Japanese-American, would write it down on a form. The Nisei translators were a source of deep confusion for the women. These young men looked Japanese, but their posture, their language, their very being was American. They were a living embodiment of a world the women could not comprehend. After being registered, each woman was photographed. A mugshot, front and profile. For many, it was the first time they had seen their own reflection in months. They stared at the gaunt, haunted faces in the prints, barely recognizing themselves. Then they were fingerprinted, their fingers rolled in black ink and pressed onto a card. This act, so intimate and yet so impersonal, marked their entry into a new kind of existence. They were no longer just a name. They were a file. They were assigned a number. This number, stamped onto a metal tag or a wristband, became their new designation. This process was a form of administrative personhood. To the American system, they were no longer anonymous enemies. They were case file 734 or prisoner 1138. Their existence was now documented, tracked, and managed. Records were kept of their health, their work assignments, their mail. A file that might eventually contain 20 or 30 pages was created for a woman who, weeks before, had believed her only legacy would be a heap of bones in a forgotten cave. This cold, bureaucratic recognition was a world away from the dehumanizing rhetoric of war. It was not dignity, but it was a form of acknowledgement. Their work, too, was recategorized. Instead of the desperate, unpaid labor of survival, they were assigned scheduled tasks in the camp's laundry or kitchens. For this, they were paid a small wage in scrip, a form of camp currency, which could be used at a canteen to buy small items like soap or candy. The act of being paid, however symbolic, was a profound shift. It implied their time had value. It implied a contractual relationship, however unequal. They were being integrated as the lowest-level workers into the camp's meticulously organized economic system. This new reality created a constant, low-level friction with the ideological framework the women had carried with them into captivity. Their entire worldview had been predicated on a set of assumptions that were now being systematically violated. The central pillar of this ideology was the nobility of Gyokusai, literally, shattered jewel. It was the belief that death in service to the emperor was beautiful and honorable, while surrender was the ultimate shame, a stain on one's family and nation for generations. They were the women who had failed to shatter. They had survived, and now they were living in a state of profound dishonor. Yet day by day, the physical reality of the camp chipped away at this belief. How could a state of shame include 3 meals a day? How could dishonor feel so much like relief? The cognitive dissonance was a constant, humming torment. This was amplified by the inversion of familiar social roles. In their villages, society was a rigid hierarchy. They were accustomed to seeing American men only as soldiers, figures of violent authority. But in the camp, they saw them in other roles. They saw them as cooks, sweating over stoves. They saw them as clerks, hunched over paperwork. They saw them as truck drivers and medics. These were ordinary jobs performed by ordinary men. This demystified their captors, reducing them from monstrous archetypes to fallible human beings. Even more disruptive was the sight of American women. Army nurses and Red Cross volunteers would sometimes visit the camp. These women wore uniforms. They drove vehicles. They gave orders to male subordinates. They moved with a confidence and authority that was utterly foreign to the Japanese women, whose lives had been defined by domesticity and deference to men. The sight of an American nurse calmly directing 2 male orderlies was a quiet but profound shock, challenging the very bedrock of their understanding of gender. Occasionally, the tables of competence were turned entirely. In one instance, a young Okinawan woman in the camp went into a difficult, premature labor. The American camp doctor, a young man with limited obstetric experience, was struggling. The baby was in a breech position. Panic began to ripple through the barracks. Hannah, the nurse, stepped forward. She had assisted in hundreds of births in her village. Speaking through a translator, she calmly and firmly explained the procedure needed to turn the infant. The American doctor, seeing the quiet competence in her eyes, hesitated and then stepped aside. Hannah took control. With skilled hands and soothing words, she guided the mother through the ordeal. A few tense hours later, a healthy, though small, baby was born. For that one afternoon, Hannah was not a prisoner. She was the most knowledgeable person in the room. The American doctor thanked her, a simple act of professional respect that transcended their roles as captor and captive. For the other women, witnessing this was a revelation. It was a demonstration that their knowledge, their skills, still had value. It was proof that they were not just empty vessels to be filled with American food, but people who still possessed their own power. Was it possible, they began to wonder, that honor was not just found in dying, but also in the skill of one's hands? The reality of the women's experience is not just anecdotal. It is supported by a scaffold of historical records. The official documents of the era paint a picture of a system so vast and well-supplied that its baseline standard of living for prisoners often exceeded that of Allied civilians back home. Weekly menus from Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, which held Japanese and German POWs, show a diet that regularly included beef roast, pork chops, chicken, and access to fresh milk, butter, and eggs. These were items heavily rationed for the American public, who were living with ration books and meatless Tuesdays. The logic was not to pamper the enemy, but to adhere strictly to the Geneva Convention's dictate of providing rations equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the depot troops of the detaining power. The American depot soldier was the best-fed soldier in the world, and so, by extension, were his prisoners. International Red Cross inspection reports from 1943 through 1945 corroborate this. Teams of neutral Swiss inspectors made regular visits to POW camps across the United States. Their reports, now housed in archives in Geneva, are filled with dry, factual observations. They measured the square footage of living space per prisoner. They noted the number of showers and latrines. They confirmed the provision of soap, toothbrushes, and hygiene supplies. The reports are not laudatory. They are clinical. They note compliance with Article 11, food rations, Article 13, clothing, and Article 22, intellectual and sporting activities. What these bureaucratic checklists reveal is a system striving for, and largely achieving, a standardized, adequate level of care. From the women's perspective, this was an inexplicable luxury. A woman like Hannah, recalling her desperate efforts to keep wounds clean with boiled rags, would have seen the Red Cross inspector's note on the sufficient supply of sterile gauze, not as a bureaucratic detail, but as a miracle. The sheer scale of the logistics involved is staggering. By 1945, the U.S. Army held over 425,000 prisoners of war on American soil. The Quartermaster Corps, in its official history, states that it was responsible for procuring over 1 million tons of food annually for this population alone. This number is an abstraction, but for the women in Onulialai, it had a tangible reality. Chio, seeing a truck unload a pallet of canned peaches, was witnessing the endpoint of that million-ton supply chain. She didn't know the number, but she could see the evidence. She could see that her captors possessed a power that had nothing to do with fighting spirit. It was the power of production, of organization, of logistics. It was the power of a nation that could fight a global war while still producing enough canned peaches to feed its enemies. This evidence, delivered daily on their meal trays and in the well-stocked infirmary, was more potent than any propaganda. It forced a fundamental reevaluation of why they had lost the war. The emotional cost of this abundance was immense. The systematic provision of care was not received as a simple kindness to be grateful for. It was an indictment of the world that had failed them. It triggered a profound and complex survivor's guilt that settled deep in their bodies. The initial shock of the ice cream was not an isolated incident. Every meal, every clean bandage, every night of safe sleep was a fresh torment. A young woman named Etsu took a bite of a fresh, crisp apple. The sweetness flooded her mouth, and with it came the vivid, sensory memory of her younger sister, dead from dysentery, crying for a sip of clean water. The taste of the apple became the taste of ash in her mouth. She ran from the mess hall and was sick behind the barracks, her body convulsing as it tried to expel not just the food, but the memory. The nights were the worst. The physical comfort of a cot and a blanket made the memory of past suffering unbearable. In the darkness, the women's minds would betray them. They were no longer distracted by the need to find food or shelter. Their minds were free to replay the horrors. A mother would lie awake, her heart pounding in the quiet, seeing the faces of her children who had been lost in the chaos of the final days on Saipan. She could almost feel the phantom weight of the baby she could no longer feed. The safety of the camp made the violence of the past feel more, not less, real. It was a wound that festered in the quiet. So much food. One woman whispered into the darkness. Too much. My brother, he ate the bark from trees. There were no words for this kind of grief. The Japanese language had a rich vocabulary for honorable suffering, for the beauty of sacrifice. It had no words for the shame of being safe while your loved ones were dead. It had no words for the psychological agony of being well fed by your enemy. So they processed it in silence in their bodies, in the tightness in their chests, in the sudden, inexplicable tears, in the way they would sometimes stop in the middle of a task, their eyes unfocused, lost in a memory no one else could see. The peak of the crisis was not loud. It was a quiet, internal shattering. It was the moment a woman realized that the worst part of her ordeal was not the starvation or the fear. It was this safe, clean, well-fed, soul-crushing present. The turning point was not an event, but a thought, a quiet revelation that reframed everything that had come before. It emerged slowly from the women's collective observation and analysis, but it crystallized in the mind of Chio, the teacher. One afternoon, she was watching a detail of American guards repairing a section of the perimeter fence. They worked with a kind of plodding, uninspired efficiency. They followed a set of instructions. They used prefabricated materials. They were not building a cage out of hatred. They were performing maintenance. And in that moment, the thought landed with the force of a physical blow. They are not being kind. They are being orderly. This was the revelation. The American abundance, the medical care, the entire predictable system of the camp was not an expression of moral character. It was not a gesture of personal compassion or a strategic act of psychological warfare meant to win their hearts and minds. It was the product of a system, a vast, impersonal, bureaucratic machine that was simply executing its programming. The implications of this insight were immediate and transformative. First, it lifted the unbearable burden of personal gratitude. The women had been struggling with the sense of obligation that came with receiving what felt like gifts from their enemies. This obligation was a source of deep shame, a betrayal of their people. But if the food on their tray was not a gift, but simply an output of a logistical equation, then there was no need for gratitude. There was no personal relationship to navigate. They could eat the food without feeling they were ingesting their own dishonor. They were simply interacting with a system, not a person. Second, this revelation offered a new, less spiritually devastating explanation for their defeat in the war. They had been taught that the war was a contest of will, a clash between the superior Japanese spirit and the decadent, materialistic West. In this framework, their defeat was a spiritual failure. But if the war was actually a contest between systems, the narrative changed. Their nation's system, which relied on spiritual fervor and the mobilization of scarce resources, had been pitted against a system of overwhelming industrial production and logistical supremacy. It wasn't a failure of spirit. It was a mismatch of industrial capacity. They had not been defeated by better men, but by better factories, better supply lines. This was a cold, unsentimental truth, but it was also a profound relief. It allowed them to begin to separate their personal honor from the nation's military defeat. The system had failed, not their souls. The quiet hum of the camp's generator became, for Chio, the sound of this new understanding. It was the sound of a machine doing its work. The journey from a single, sensory moment to a system-level understanding was now complete. The tear that fell from Fumiko's eye in the first moments of her captivity was a reaction to a stimulus she could not name. It was a tear of confusion, of sensory overload, of repressed grief. By the end, the women understood that this tear was a data point. It was evidence of a collision between two irreconcilable worlds. The microscopic event of a woman tasting sugar for the first time was inextricably linked to the macroscopic realities of international law and industrial-scale logistics. Her personal, physiological response was a direct consequence of a clause written in Geneva years before she was born. This creates a clear causal ladder. The existence of a codified international standard for the treatment of prisoners, the Geneva Convention, led to its adoption as U.S. military policy. This policy, in turn, activated the immense logistical power of the American war machine, not just for combat, but for administration. The result was a system of containment that produced a surplus of material goods, food, medicine, shelter, as a standard operating procedure. For the women entering this system from a world of desperate scarcity and an ideology of sacrificial death, This predictable abundance did not produce gratitude. Instead, it produced a profound cognitive dissonance. This dissonance, this clash between what they had been taught to believe and what their bodies were now experiencing, became the central crisis of their captivity. Their eventual resolution was not emotional, but analytical. It was the realization that they were cogs in a machine that was neither cruel nor kind, but simply functional. The durable takeaway from their experience is a nuanced one. It suggests that the structures and systems we build can have moral consequences that far exceed their intended purpose. The U.S. military did not set out to heal the psychological trauma of its captives. It set out to manage them efficiently and in accordance with international law. Yet, this simple, systematic provision of security and sustenance had a more corrosive effect on the women's wartime ideology than any deliberate propaganda campaign could have. It demonstrates that material reality can be a more powerful agent of change than abstract belief. A system doesn't need to have a soul to change a person's mind. Sometimes, all it needs is to be predictable, consistent, and full of an inexplicable number of campeaches. The women's story is a testament to human resilience, but not in the way we usually imagine. Theirs was not the resilience of unwavering faith, but the resilience of adaptation, of the painful, pragmatic process of seeing the world for what it is. The tin cup is cool in Fumiko's hand. The last of the white cream has melted into a sweet, milky pool at the bottom. She looks at it, then raises the cup to her lips and drinks the last of it. The sweetness is still there, but it is no longer a shock. It is a piece of information. It is the taste of a different kind of power, a different kind of world. She now understands what she is holding. It is not a gift. It is not a trick. It is a product, a piece of evidence. It is a ration, distributed according to a regulation. Her tears were not for the sweetness alone, but for the world the sweetness implied. What we mistake for kindness is often just the quiet hum of a system working as designed. Notice what assumptions begin to shift when you start looking for the system instead of the sentiment. Their story did not end in the camp. For these women, the greatest challenge was returning to a home that had declared them dead. What happens when the survivors of one system must reintegrate into another? We explore that next. Subscribe for more stories that uncover the hidden systems shaping our world.